to give up teaching in the book of Galatians, what the church is doing. Very quickly, I saw just at least two people say, oh, we can read Galatians anytime. And so today's lesson, I'm not going to hurry it. I don't know everything. We'll get down to the 6-day war, and we'll go through some stuff there. So anybody that wants to ask a question or add a comment to the lesson, it's going to be wide open today. There's a lot of fighting going on in Israel today. The question is, who is fighting with Israel and why? Just remember this. Israel is God's chosen people and God's promised land. This is not going to be an in-depth study of the land of Israel, close to it. We're not studying future events or prophecies. That's not part of today's lesson. That's for another time. This lesson is designed to show you what is happening in Israel today, and the big word is why it's happening. However, we will have to go back and recap some of the past events in history of Israel's borders. So we'll have a better understanding about the fighting that's going on in Israel today. Countries bordering Israel. First, we have Lebanon up there. It has a small border on it. Syria borders them. Very small area of touching. Jordan has got a big area. And then Egypt's got a pretty big area. These are the four countries that border Israel. It did then. It is today. We'll go back to 70 A.D. After the Romans invaded Israel in 70 A.D., destroying the city of Jerusalem and the temple, the ownership of the land of Israel changed many times since then and the way it is today. In fact, much of the time, Israel lay unoccupied by any major country. In the 12th century BC, the Roman emperor wanted the name of Israel and Judah and Judea completely wiped out. He wanted those names gone for that land, and he wanted that land replaced with a different name. He asked the question, who do the Jews despise the most? When he was told it was the Philistines, he ordered that the southern portion of Israel be named Philistia. Over time, the name evolved from Philistia to Palestine. There were Arabic nomads who moved from place to place, and they began to settle in this land called Palestine. We know it as the land of Israel and the land of the Jews, but unoccupied, they settled in there. These Arabic nomads mostly lived in the southern part of Israel, which included Jerusalem and in part of what we know today as the West Bank. We'll come back to the Palestinians in a little while because they play a big role in today's news in Israel. In 1948, the British, who had control of Israel at that time, they gave the land back to the Israelites. This did not go well with these Arabic nomads who were now calling themselves Palestinians. The land in green up here on the map is what the British gave back to Israel in 1948. Interesting. The British did not give Israel back the Gaza Strip. They did not give back the West Bank, nor the Golan Heights. and only half of the city of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's split, kind of like you remember way back when in Germany, Berlin was split. Well, we got a split city here in Jerusalem when they first gave it back. Since these Arabic nomads, now called Palestinians, had been living in this land and called it Palestine, they believed that they should be in possession of this land and not the Jews. Do you see the conflict building? You see who the Palestinians are? There are a lot of people that sympathize with the Palestinians. Yeah, they lived in there, it's now theirs. That's a major conflict today. Today, these Palestinians want to be called a country and be recognized as a member of the United Nations. But they're not a race. They have no land. So therefore, the UN does not recognize them. Let me see if I give you an example. I hope this fits. It would be like a band of gypsies living in some vacant land in America today saying that we won't be called a nation and recognized as the UN. And that would never happen, right? It's the same thing what the Palestinians are trying to do. They got some unoccupied land at the time, and they say, well, but you're not a country, you're not a race. Really?
If I gave Steve your car, what would you think about it?
Not a good
You wouldn't
deal.
like that very much,
Yeah.
right, Steve? That's where the Palestinians feel.
That's a good way to put it.
The British gave the land to somebody that the Palestinians didn't like,
Yeah.
and the Palestinians thought that was theirs.
Yeah, they do. And they're still fighting for it. We'll talk more later. The biggest section is the West Bank, which was not given back to Israel, but the Palestinians, now they're trying to settle in the West Bank. And we'll get to that in a little bit later, but that's a good example. Thanks, Wes. Does that make a little bit of sense? The things with the Palestinians, we'll get into more of it. These Palestinians formed a coalition called the Palestine Liberation Organization, or you hear it called the PLO. That's what that group calls themselves. Now, the PLO is recognized as a governing body over the so-called Palestinians by the Arabic nations. They're not recognized as a nation, but they recognize the PLO is the organization that governs these Palestinians. There is no race, Palestinians. They're mostly a mixture of Muslims. Now, I hope this information helps understand who the Palestinians are. Yeah, Ken.
Excuse me. Aren't they, when they do get land or what they want, isn't it the West Bank that they want plus the Gaza Strip?
Yeah, the West Bank is what they're after, and I've got some slides later on. We're going to talk about what's happening in the West Bank. But you're right, yeah.
That used to be Jordan.
Huh?
It used to be Jordan up until.
Yeah, and Jordan really doesn't care about it. They don't try to go and defend it. They don't do anything. It's just, it's kind of. You remember when the Israelites came in to settle the land from the Exodus, that there were two tribes that said, well, we would like to stay on the east side over here. And they said, well, you can, Moses said, but you have to go over with the other tribes and help them conquer that land, and then you can come back and settle this. And part of that was the old West, what is now called the old West Bank over there. So that thing, Jordan really doesn't have any interest in that land. But mostly it's been under Jordan's rule. I will be discussing Israel's fighting with the Palestinians later in this lesson. Here it comes. Next, we're going to be discussing the Six-Day War. It started in June 5th, 1967. Every Christian should understand about this Six-Day War. Anybody who wants to interject into this as I'm talking, feel free to do so, because I don't have all the information. The Six-Day War started on June 5th, 1967. Let's look back at a couple of months and see just a few events that led up to the Six-Day War. In April 1967, tensions were rising between the Israelites and the Arab countries. Russia sent word to the Egyptian president Gamal Nasser that Israel was moving troops to Syria's northern border and were preparing for an all-out attack, which was an outright lie. That's the way Russia operates, starting trouble. Anybody know who was head of Russia at that time?
Khrushchev.
Huh?
Khrushchev.
Before him. Brezhnev. Brezhnev. But you weren't afraid to answer. Y'all be like Willie, just speak up. It's okay. On May 23rd, remember the war starts on June 5th. As we're talking about, on May 23rd, Egypt ordered that the Strait of Tiran, and you can see it circled on the map down there, that be closed to all Israeli ships, which cut off Israel's ability to import and export through the Red Sea and then into the Indian Ocean. So that was their first move. In a show of support for his Syrian allies, Nasser ordered Egyptian forces to advance into the Sinai Peninsula. That Sinai Peninsula belongs to Egypt. So the forces, the tanks, they had 900 tanks and they had about 9,000 military people. Egypt sent, I was doing from memory and it's on the screen, Willie, getting old. Egypt sent 90,000 soldiers and 90 tanks across to the desert to Israel's southern border. Then in late May, the Fatah, and I will talk about it later, Fatah, along with Syrian troops, began firing rockets from the Gaza Strip over to Israeli territory. Did the Israelites ever own the Gaza Strip? No. You remember when they settled the land, God told Moses, tell the people, you go into the new promised land, you kill everyone. All the Canaanites, men, women, children. Sounds bad, but it's God's way of punishing them. He could have killed them himself if he wanted to, but he wanted to see if Israel would obey. The tribe of Dan was supposed to settle up here. And he got over there and saw the Philistines, said, they're too big, we're not doing it. So he settled just outside of it, and half of Dan's tribe went up north. Israel did not do what God said and go into that land. And so it's been a thorn in the side ever since. It was these three events that forced Israel into making plans for war. Israel knew that if there was an all-out attack on Israel by Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, they would be totally outmanned by soldiers, aircraft, and tanks. The military leaders in Israel determined that the only way to stop these four countries was to strike first. Make sense? And strike first they did. Israel had been sending planes out over the Mediterranean Sea for practice maneuvers, and they were being tracked by Egyptian and Syrian radar. They'd see them every morning, get out and go out over the Mediterranean to have exercises and come back. But as the Israeli planes went further out over the water, they were no longer under Egypt's or Syria's radar screen. Hint, hint, what's going to happen with that? Israel's plan was to strike Egypt first. The Israeli pilots did not know anything about this planned strike until 5 hours before takeoff. They had to keep it quiet. Israeli intelligence had noted that the Egyptian pilots would take off every morning around 6 a.m. These are the pilots in Egypt, and they would go check the border out between the Sinai Peninsula, which they own, and Israel. They go and they fly and they check out the border and they go back. Yeah. These pilots would return about 7 a.m. and then all Egyptian pilots would be having breakfast together. See it coming? On June 5th, 1967, these Israeli Defense Forces initiated what they called Operation Focus, a coordinated aerial attack on Egypt. That morning, some 200 aircraft took off from Israel in 3 staggered waves, 10 minutes apart. That's going to be important. They headed out to the Mediterranean, just like always. Syria and Egypt could see them on the radar. Oh, they're going out for practice maneuvers. They didn't know those planes were now armed. With staggered starts of 10 minutes apart, 3 waves of fighter jets went out over the Mediterranean, dropped down low enough for the Egyptian radar not to detect them as they came back in, and then the first wave headed towards Egypt's airfields. The first wave of bomber jets bombed airstrips first, and then the planes on the ground second. Why did they do that? Come on, you guys know.
Couldn't take off.
Huh?
Couldn't take off.
Yeah, if you missed some of the planes, they couldn't take off anyway, right? I tell you, the Israelis were smart. They planned it out. After 7 minutes of striking, these jets had to exit Egypt and return to Israel for reloading and refueling because the next wave was just 10 minutes behind them. Do you see that happening, how they're doing? They're coming in? Catching the Egyptians by surprise, they assaulted 18 different airfields. I think only 3 of them were really major ones, but they counted them all as they were doing that. And they eliminated roughly 90% of the Egyptians' air force as it sat on the ground, and roughly 300 Egyptian planes. If I can ever get this thing opened up. Nasser, who is the leader of Egypt at the time, he did not want the other Arab countries to know how badly the Egyptians failed in their attempt by the airstrikes by Israel. So he was embarrassed to be. So let's see what Nasser does. Nasser sent word to Jordan and Syria that the Egyptians won in the surprise attack. That's history. That's real. You worked in Israel's favor, though. When the Israeli planes left Egypt and headed for Jordan and Syria, they were picked up on Jordan's radar, but they thought it was the Egyptian planes coming to help them. See how much that big lie helped Israel? The Israeli air attack moved to Jordan, Syria, and actually Iraq. A lot of people don't know that. If you think it was just a border, but Iraq was not necessarily in the war. They were given supplies to Syria that they needed. Israeli attack moved to strike Jordan, Syria, and Iraq airfields and planes that were still on the ground. Again, Israel targeted airstrips first and then the planes on the ground next. I believe this is the first mention of Iraq in our study. They do not border Israel, but they would surely give fighting support to Syria and to Jordan. Israel all but secured victory by establishing air superiority. They controlled the airspace. But fierce ground fighting continued for several more days. The ground war in Egypt began on June 5th, right after the air strikes. Some of history's greatest tank battles were fought between the Egyptians and Israeli armor in the scorching hot conditions of the Sinai Desert. Can you imagine 900 tanks? And Israel sending their tanks this way. And they're coming at each other. It's which tanks can handle the desert the best played a part in it. In concert with the airstrikes, Israeli tanks and infantry stormed across the border and into the Sinai Peninsula, and at the same time into the Gaza Strip. Egyptian forces put up a spirited resistance, but later fell into disarray after they were ordered to retreat. Here's Nasser again. Now what's he doing? He's retreating. Over the next several days, Israeli forces pursued and routed Egyptians all the way across the Sinai, inflicting severe casualties. So Israel pushed them all the way back out of the Sinai. A second front in the Six-Day War opened on June the 5th when Jordan, reacting to false reports of the Egyptian victory, began shelling Israeli positions in Jerusalem. Of course, they thought, oh, we'll start shelling them now. Israelis' air force is gone. The Egyptians wiped them out. That's their thinking. That's what they were told by Nasser. Israel responded with a devastating counterattack on East Jerusalem. Remember, they didn't own the east side. That was not given back by the British. But they had a counterattack on East Jerusalem and the West Bank. I don't know if I have my slides. If it comes up later, it's a repeat. But Israel did not want to destroy Jerusalem. They didn't want, they needed to conquer the East Jerusalem, but they didn't want to drop bombs in there and destroy it all. So they did a ground attack, and what they did is that Israel sent planes over and dropped paratroopers down and get in there and win that position without having to bomb so much and tear up East Jerusalem. And it may say that in here. I've worked on it so long, I'm not sure. It only took 3 days for the Israeli forces to defeat the Jordanian Legion. They got defeated on the ground. Their air forces were wiped out. On the morning of June 7th, the order was given to recapture the old city of Jerusalem. Israeli paratroopers stormed the city and secured it. On June 7th, Israeli troops captured the old city of Jerusalem and celebrated by praying at the Western Wall. After conquering the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the battle moved to the Syrian border called the Golan Heights. Israel had won back the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. The only fighting front was against Syria and the Golan Heights. I didn't leave out Lebanon. Lebanon tried to stay neutral, but Syrian terrorists entered into Lebanon and they were shooting rockets over to Israel, but it had little impact. Lebanon wanted to be neutral in this war, but they got all their financial support from Syria, so they were an ally with Syria. So it's kind of like a little token thing. Send a few rockets to make it look like we're fighting. That's Lebanon. While most Israel's forces had been fighting the Egyptians and Jordanians, a small heroic group of soldiers were left defending the northern border against Syrians. It was not until the Jordanians and Egyptians were subdued that reinforcement now could be sent back up to the Golan Heights to help them there. Finally, after 2 days in heavy air bombardment, Israeli forces succeeded in breaking through Syria's lines at the Golan Heights. We're going to talk about that Golan Heights a little bit more depth in a minute. So Israel had won back the Sinai Peninsula, they won back Gaza, the West Bank, Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. You see all that? They won it all back at this. As they won it back, it wasn't given to them by the British in the first place, but they won those places. Israeli political leaders had no desire to fight in the Arab capitals. They didn't want to go over there and destroy them. They just wanted to protect these areas here. So they didn't pursue war, going back in and do anything else. How could such a small country win battles on 4 fronts against larger nations and accomplish this in 6 days?
Smart strategies.
Here's your answer. By the power of God. We forget sometimes when things are bad, God knows it. He's right behind us. We say take it away and He doesn't, but He knows what's ahead. We don't. We just have to have faith and move forward. The 6-day war. Who were the leaders of these 4 countries and leader of Israel in 1967? Gamal Nasser in Egypt, Hafez al-Assad. Lebanon was Charles Hilo. Got more to talk about that in a minute. Jordan was King Hussein. Israel, Moshe Dayan. Y'all remember him with the eye patch over his eye? That's pictures way back in the 60s. I know y'all remember the 60s. Yeah, he was the guy there. Did the United States have any part in this war? The U.S. was an ally of Israel, but wanted to stay out of this war. Well, why? Remember, the U.S. had just gotten out of Vietnam War, and they didn't want to go right back into another one. And we just finished one that the people didn't like. They wanted to stay out, so they didn't do anything. However, somebody waved the arm over the side. Thank you. The United States did have one Navy vessel in the Mediterranean Sea at that time. Anybody want to know the name of it?
Liberty.
Liberty. The USS Liberty. There's a picture of it, the USS Liberty. Israel, thinking that this was an Egyptian warship, fired on the ship by a jet fighter and also by an Israeli torpedo boat. So they got hit twice. They thought it was an Egyptian.
They didn't think it was.
Huh?
They knew it was,
You don't think so?
but they knew exactly who it was.
Did they think that? Well,
They didn't want the U.S. listening to what they were doing.
yeah. And what kind of ship was this, Willie?
Intelligence ship.
Yeah. They say it's an information gathering ship. That's the long phrase for SPY. Spy ship. Right there. So they got hit by, now 34 Americans died and 171 others were wounded. Well, you see this. In 1968, Israel paid $25 million for the families that died, and then they paid $26 million for the families of the wounded. And I didn't have room to get it on my slide, but then just about 3 years ago, they paid $6 million for the damage to the ship. And I won't cover that at all, but they paid $6 million. So they either admitted their mistake or was covering it up, like Willie said, that they didn't want
The
us
Liberty
involved.
ships were old World War II ships.
Yeah.
And they were refitted as intelligence gathering.
Yeah. Well, they really knocked them
They
out.
weren't very valuable.
Yeah, okay. So what land did Israel conquer? Best answer this by looking at our map again. Everything in green is the land that Israel won back during the 6-day war. They won back the Golan Heights. They won back the West Bank. They won back East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and the entire Sinai Peninsula in the 6-day war. Israel's failures. You need to understand this. Israel failed to follow up on the land they conquered, and they failed to occupy the land. When Romans invaded and took over the land of Israel, what did they do? They put soldiers in there to keep it under Roman rule. You can do what you want to, just don't break any Roman laws and keep paying taxes back to Caesar. So Israel, they conquered all this, but they didn't leave any soldiers in there. They didn't leave any military in there. They failed to do that. Major mistakes. We'll look at each one of these areas one at a time. In the West Bank, Israel for the past several years has been building condos and apartments and communities in an effort to hold claim to this land. But guess who else is doing the same thing? The Palestinians are doing the same thing. They're trying to build homes. So you see, not so much on the news, you get more about that from the newspaper than you do on television anymore. You would have to be listening at BBC or one of these networks. But there's a lot going on in the West Bank right now. The Israelis are trying to build condos, communities, and stuff, and so are the Palestinians. And so they're trying to, each group is trying to possess that land. That was the mistake that they made. They should have done it immediately, but it's still going today. When you read anything about the West Bank, that's what's happening. They're trying to establish a hold on that land. The Palestinians, that's their best shot right now. I think I'll say that later anyway. East Jerusalem, there's continued fighting between the Israelis and Palestinians over the control of this part of Israel. It's still the same war going on in battle and skirmishes now. They didn't hold on to it, and now the Palestinians are trying to keep hold on to it. The Gaza Strip, they conquered the Gaza Strip, but once again, they did not occupy it or leave any Israeli soldiers to control it. So here's the biggest thorn in your side. You conquered the land, and now you just let it go back to where it was, and they're a thorn in your side again today. That's a major spot of conflict. So when you read something in the paper or see something on TV about the Gaza Strip, you know what's going on. The Sinai Peninsula, Israel offered a deal to Egypt concerning the Sinai Peninsula. Israel would give this land back to Egypt if they agreed to never invade Israel. The deal was accepted by Egypt. Probably no big deal. Probably worthless land anyway, except access to water. Yeah.
The UN contracted with E-Systems in Greenville, Texas, to establish a monitoring system in the Sinai.
Oh, really?
And E-Systems installed several listening stations in the Sinai, and we're under contract for several years to monitor and man those stations.
So you think they were probably closer down towards Egypt and modern Egypt?
No,
or
it's
just
just closer to Israel.
Close to Israel, okay.
It was kind of like a peacekeeping mission, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
Yeah, okay, we're gonna see another one of those in a minute, but yeah, I didn't know that was giving us that. So probably it wasn't a bad deal for Israel. We'll have another mention of that a little later. The Golan Heights, this is critical to the defense of Israel. It is Syria's only border with Israel. The fighting got so serious that in 1973, the United Nations stepped in and created a demilitarized zone called the EMZ. And I'm going to call it DMZ. It's a hard word to pronounce. Between the countries. So they put no man's land and separated on the Golan Heights Israel from Syria. I think I got some more on that. Here's what it looks like. Israel occupies the Golan Heights. And I know I tell you some stuff, and it comes back later on the screen, but that's so critical, because I'll show you a picture after a while. That's some high ground, and if Syria owns it, boy, they can shoot down on Israel and just tear them to pieces. So it's important that Israel have this plateau up there, the high ground, what we call the Golan Heights. So the lighter tan is there. That's what they've got occupied today. The DMZ, you can barely see it, but you see the separation between them and Syria. Here's a blow-up of it, a little better. The DMZ on the Golan Heights is in the little striped things. It's about 600 feet at its narrowest and 3.5 miles at its widest. It is now today controlled by the United Nations. Just not doing any good. Major terrorist groups, you might read about these sometime in the paper. The biggest one is Hamas. Hamas is a Sunni Muslim terrorist group backed by Iran and Syria. They're not a country. They are just a group of warriors. And like you say, they're backed by Iran and Syria. And we call them terrorists to claim that land. So what are we seeing in the news today about the fighting in Israel? In the Golan Heights, that is a critical one there. There are small skirmishes going on between Israeli and Syrian troops, but it seems to be escalating. It is crucial that Israel hold on to this portion of the Golan Heights for defense purposes. However, later news, Syria has been firing rockets into Israeli territory. Israel has responded by sending rockets back. But just recently, Israel sent planes inside Syria and bombed ammunition sites. That could be trouble. That could be stirring the pot. And it has recently been reported that Israel has pushed past the DMZ and are moving further into Syrian territory. We always think it's everybody attacking them. They're going across that DMZ. Now they're moving into. That's getting scary. That's what's going on today, right now. This battle could explode at any time in all-out war. Here's a view from the Golan Heights, taken from the Golan. You see how high it is? And you look down, and below you see the Sea of Galilee down there. Glenda and I, along with two other couples, had the privilege of going over there, and they put us on a bus and drove all the way around the Sea of Galilee. And when you got onto the northeast side, you look up at the Golan Heights. Oh, it's way up there. Oh, great military place for things. In the olden days, in the 1200s and 1300s, where did they build castles? On the highest piece of ground they could find. Well, that would be this place here, the Golan Heights. You don't want to lose that. You'll be very vulnerable if you lose that to another country. But they're not just defending it, they're kind of getting aggressive now. And don't know what's going to happen there. The Gaza Strip. Gaza, supported by Hamas, is firing more and more rockets into Israel and Israel territory, and Israel responding with the same. That's going on today. The conflict here, too, is heating up. There's fighting going on right now, today.
Wally, what's the distance in miles like between the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights? Do you know?
No, I sure don't. Why would you ask that?
Because when you're fighting on two fronts, the distance to me would matter. You gotta.
Yeah, well, you get your military split up in two locations for sure. Yeah,
That are
pretty far apart. I mean, yeah. Well,
I saw a picture of a dump truck that was in the Gaza Strip. And the dump truck couldn't raise the bed. Underneath the bed was rockets.
yeah,
4 rockets.
yeah. Well, the Gaza Strip looks small, but with Hamas over there, the terrorist group, and they're the ones that's doing all this. Ken?
I think the Gaza Strip's about 28 or 30 miles long, just a few miles across. And probably from Gaza Strip up to the Golan Heights is a couple hundred miles.
Yeah.
It's not real far.
Yeah, it's got to be over 100 miles, it looks like, if the Gaza Strip is 30 miles. But yeah, but then too, they're trying to hang on to the West Bank. That's not a whole lot of fighting. That's just who can build the buildings fast enough and get people to move. If you were Israeli, would you want to go in one of the condos over there? We'd give it to you for free, will it? You want to go? Not in the West Bank, but they are getting, so you're probably getting more of the poor people going over and filling those up. It's not a fact, but it's believed that a lot of these people, they're paid to go over there. They're trying to occupy the land with Israelis to live there. But see, they had their opportunities when they had won it the first time. Leave the military there until you get all. So they make some really bad mistakes right after that 6-day war. The Palestinians, they're desperately trying to obtain a land of their own, and the West Bank is their best shot. They're not going to get anything else. If they can get the West Bank and possess it, then they might go back to the UN and say, well, now would you recognize us as a member of the United Nations? So that's what's going on. Not a small amount of fighting, but possession and building is what's important. Now, when we get 10:30, I don't care where we are, we're going to stop, and we'll pick it up tomorrow. Because I have no way of timing these things to know where we should be. So we'll stop. So you don't want to, it's like in way back when you were a kid and you went to the movies and the bad man's on the horse, he's coming after you, just about ready to shoot him, it stops and come back next Saturday. Well, that's what we have to hear today. We're got 5 minutes. Ken?
One thing we gotta remember is that the financing for all this is done by the Saudis and the oil-rich countries there in the Persian Gulf, and we're trying to make them pump more oil, and so the oil backdrop and all that money is a backdrop for all of this. And we're on one side, and the Saudis on the other. Or the Saudis are in there, and the Russians are in there, and
Yeah, there's a lot going on. Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq, all three are Arabic countries, and they all support Gaza, Egypt, and Lebanon, and they support all of these that border.
And they pay Hamas. They're backing Hamas and Hezbollah.
Yeah, because both Hamas and the Hezbollah, which it's a smaller group now, they're out of Syria. And Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia are giving them weapons and ammunitions, and then they're going up at the top to Lebanon, that's Hezbollah, and there's not too many of them, but Hamas. And I'm going to show you something else about the Gaza Strip, how they're getting their artillery, just a second. We're not hearing too much out of Egypt, but we know that they're helping Hamas sneak military weapons and supplies to Gaza. So you see what happened when we gave them that land back? Israel did. Now they are connected to the Gaza Strip. So now Egypt can be in the war against the Israelites by going through Gaza Strip and giving them all the ammunition and whatever they need to supply them. And Hamas is the military. Just like we have a military in the United States, the Army, the Air Force, the Marines. Well, Hamas is the military, but it's sponsored out of Syria, and it's backed by the 3 Arab countries, Arabic countries, and by Egypt on there. So when we didn't possess that hurt. When we said earlier that, we gave them the land back, the Sinai Peninsula, if they'd agree not to attack. Well, it sounded like, okay, that's a good deal because they've not attacked. But they're still feeding stuff into Gaza, and Hamas is used. That's why they're not running out of military supplies. Makes sense a little bit? Lebanon, way up there at the top. Lebanon has been relatively quiet. The size of the terrorist group Hezbollah, it's decreased. Not out completely, but you don't read much about them anymore. Got a lot of good stuff to tell you about Lebanon later as it comes up. There it is. Did you know that the president of Lebanon had to be a Maronite Christian? How many knew that? 1? Okay. In Lebanon, the president has to be a Christian. Now they say Maronite, that's just a name. We could say, I'm a Baptist Christian, and he's a Catholic Christian, and he's something else. So it's just, that's what they call Christianity. It's more like Catholic, because I think they They defer to the Pope for directions. But, so is that a good deal, that the president of Lebanon has to be a Christian? Well, sounds good, but The prime minister must be a Sunni Muslim and the speaker of the National Assembly a Shiite Muslim. So now you got a three-pronged government. You got one a Christian and two Muslims. Not so good after all, is it? But there is no persecution going on in Lebanon against these Christians. So that's not too bad. Okay. It says, so who are the leaders of these countries today? And that's where I'm going to stop it. We're going to go back and look at today who the leaders are and what's going on. And we'll just pick it up from there next Sunday. Any comment before we close? Because I wanted to go slow enough. Everybody has a chance to talk.
I know Willie was talking about the Sinai deal, and the guys from Greenville that went over there, they would have to visit Israel one day, and the next day they'd do their business over in the Sinai before each day. That's what I was understood. I was working out there during that time.
Did they have to go into Israel first and then get into Sinai? Or could they go?
I just heard each day they went to each one just to show equality.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I got it.
I think
All
we're
right.
gonna
I'm going
use
to
the
stand up.
right-
We're going to close in prayer. Don't miss